Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the central ideas, which runs throughout all of Plato's works, in which Socrates is one of the main characters, but particularly exemplified here in the Crito, is this notion of living in accordance with what we could call principles, some sort of doctrine, some sort of fixed point that one holds to until one finds something better, something more adequate than that. And this is really integral to the entire Socratic and Platonic approach. This is something that's distinctive about Socrates, part of the reason why he's actually going to get executed. Notice, too, I've put living or dying in accordance with principle, because in this case the question is whether he should flee Athens and violate the things that he has held dear, the things that he's taught, the things that he has put forth to the public, the things that he and his friends have agreed on, or whether he should stick with those, regardless of what the consequences are going to be. In this case, the consequence being his death by execution in a rather unjust way. So, what do we mean by living in accordance with principle? It means sticking with what you've actually settled on, saying that I'm not going to change things from case to case to case just to suit my whims, just to advance my interest, just to avoid some pain, just to get some pleasure. Nothing is as important as consistency, you might say. And Socrates is saying this in response to Crito, because Crito has already advanced these arguments, which I've talked about in another core concept video. Look, Socrates, I've got the guard bribed, I've got a ship ready, I've got a place for you to go, money's no object, I'm rich, I'm happy to do this, let's get the hell out of here. And Socrates says, let's think this through. And here's one of the responses that he's making to Crito in this, but this is also something that you're going to see in other dialogues as well. He says, didn't we say that this is the case? Didn't we say that this is the case? Don't we have to follow through on those things? Or are we just going to say, well, normally I go along with this rule, but if it's a matter of dying, then I can bend the rules a bit for myself. Socrates is saying, no, you can't bend that rule. It's not a rule if you can bend it. It's not a principle if you're going to set it aside whenever it's convenient for you. So this is really an important idea here. Now that doesn't mean that he's totally inflexible. He also is willing to reflect. He says, Crito, let's think about this. Is this a case in which we could abrogate this principle? Are there any better principles that we could appeal to? You can be open to persuasion. He says, Crito, go ahead and make your case. As a matter of fact, I'll try to make the case to myself. I'll think this through and see if I can't decide that it would in fact be all right for me to flee Athens. So he's not obstinate. He's not just being stubborn. He's not saying, look, once I've decided on something, I'm never going to change it. Think of this as sort of like mountain climbing. When you're mountain climbing and you've got some fixed points that you've, I forget the exact equipment. Somebody, I'm sure, will put it in a comment. You hammer the peg into the mountain. You're not going to leave that peg behind until you've got a better peg. So Socrates is saying this works this way with ideas, it works this way with our frame of reference, it works this way with our life, it works this way with the consistency of our behavior and our relationships with other people, including those with whom we're in society or a political community. So what are, in fact, the principles that he brings up here? In other dialogues, he's going to say to his interlocutors, hey, didn't we already agree that there's something like, a doctrine of recollection? That would be another example of a principle that he doesn't feel he has to prove every single time, and he's not going to abandon it until he comes up with something better. In this case, there's actually 3 ones that are enunciated or articulated explicitly, and then there's another one that kind of slips under the radar, and we'll come to that one last, because it brings it all together. So he spends a lot of time, and I'm actually shooting another core concept specifically on this particular, you might say, epistemological principle. We shouldn't accept the opinions of just anybody, and we shouldn't care about what the many think, because we should care about the opinions of those who are actually wise or knowledgeable or expert or authorities or competent. All these different names get used. And basically the idea behind this is we should only pay attention to what the people who actually have some sort of justification for their beliefs actually have to say to us. So in horsemanship, we don't pay attention to the crowd, we pay attention to the person who actually has some competency in animal husbandry. In finance, we go to the accountant or we go to the financial advisor. In medicine, we don't ask, Uncle Ray or, the guy on the street, we ask a doctor. And we could go down the line for each of these. So when it comes to matters of right and wrong, we don't worry about what the crowd thinks. We worry, Socrates says, about that one guy who actually has his head on straight with respect to these moral principles or ethics in general as a system. That guy, we pay attention to him. Turns out Socrates will, be the closest thing that we can come to it in this dialogue. So that's one really important principle. Another principle that Socrates uses here, which we see coming up in other Socratic dialogues as well, is that one should never willingly do wrong to another person. And this is a very broad extent. What does he mean by do wrong there? One should never willingly harm unjustly another person. So that also means one shouldn't retaliate, returning evil for evil, according to Socrates. It's very much like the Sermon on the Mount idea of turning the other cheek. And you see this in the Gorgias, you see this in several other Platonic dialogues. This was a consistent doctrine of Socrates. You could say, well, what about going to war or stuff like that? He actually talks about, if you're ordered to go out to war by the state, then you are justified in doing that. But as a private citizen, one should never willingly harm other people, whether it's one's fellow citizens, one's children, resident aliens from another community, in this case also the laws he's going to talk about. And the third one that's particularly interesting, that's a negatively framed moral principle. Here's a positively framed moral principle. When you've made an agreement with somebody, you should follow through on that agreement. It's the right thing to do. It's wrong not to follow through on that. So for each of these, Socrates is responding to Crito and saying, look, we don't care what the many think. We're interested in what the competent person, say the dialectician, the one who actually thinks things out, the moral philosopher, we're interested in what they think. And, people are going to say that you should flee Socrates. That's going to violate these 2 other principles. Because in doing so, I'm actually going to be retaliating against evil that's been done to me by doing evil in turn. And that's a wrong thing to do. Even if it causes me to lose my life, dying in accordance with principle, I shouldn't do it. And I made an agreement when I walked into that courtroom and I said, okay, I'm going to do a jury trial. I was making an agreement that I was going to accept the verdict of the jury and go along with it. I wasn't saying I get to take back, whatever happens. I get to, set aside the verdict, because then I would be placing myself above the entire legal apparatus. And I would be saying that I get to make exceptions for myself because I feel scared, or I don't want to die, or it would be inconvenient for me to die at this time, or anything along those lines. Now, notice that there is a sort of meta-principle governing all of this, which he says a little bit earlier on in his discussion with Crito. He says that we should follow principles until we find some better ones. And if we can't find some better ones, Crito, these are the three that we have in this case. These are the three that are operative, you might say. So unless you can put some other stuff on the table in discussion, and of course Crito can't, although we might be able to as interlocutors of Socrates, I'm going to have to go along with the verdict and stay here, and thanks for making all these arrangements, Crito, but I can't follow them because it's more important to me to actually follow through on the kind of life that I've been living this entire time. A life in which I was devoted to trying to find the right way and to stick with it, and not inflexibly, of course, but, something that I could rely on, something that other people could look at and say, yeah, that guy, you can trust him. There could be some better principles, but unless you actually demonstrate them, if you already have some principles, Socrates is saying, you got to follow those. So that is, like I said, a meta-principle. It's a principle about how you ought to follow these principles in this case, but it's also one about, principle in general. So, like I said at the beginning, this is something that is really central to Socrates' entire approach to morality and Plato's approach to morality. And you're going to see this in other thinkers throughout history as well, in part because, what he's talking about here is something that goes beyond Plato or Socrates and beyond ancient Athens or even ancient Greece. It's talking about consistency.